I've seen so many social media posts, TikTok and X, calling for the explicit assassination of my friend and colleague Nigel. So the Prime Minister doing this with his cabinet is unprecedented in this country. And I want to be clear too, if something were to happen to Nigel, heaven forbid, God forbid, we will hold the Prime Minister responsible.
Welcome back to British Newsblog, where we cut through the political theatre to bring you the stories Westminster would rather you didn't hear. If you're tired of the mainstream media's sanitized version of events, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button now, because what we're about to discuss is precisely the sort of explosive controversy that gets conveniently buried by the evening news cycle. Right? Let's not mince words here. So Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has been directly accused of inciting violence against Nigel Farage. Yes, you heard that correctly. Not criticizing, not disagreeing with, inciting violence. And the accusation isn't coming from some fringe blogger or conspiracy theorist. It's coming directly from Reform UK's head of policy, Zia Youssef, who told Sky News in no uncertain terms that if anything happens to Farage, millions of Britons will hold the Prime Minister squarely responsible. Now that's quite the claim, isn't it? And before you dismiss it as political hyperbole, you might want to hear what Starmer actually said at the Labour Party conference on Tuesday. Picture the scene. So Keir takes to the stage at his party conference, ostensibly to outline his vision of national renewal for Britain. Standard fare for a Prime Minister, you'd think. Inspirational rhetoric, policy proposals, perhaps a bit of flag-waving. But what the country got instead was something rather more combative. Starmer declared that the next 4 years will be, quote, a fight for the soul of our country against Reform UK. Not a debate, not a democratic contest of ideas. A fight. And he didn't stop there. The Prime Minister called on his party to fight reform with everything that this movement has, and pledged that he himself would fight with every breath I have. He went further still, insisting the country must go into that battle armed, not just with words and condemnation, but with action. Armed. Battle. Fight. Strong language, wouldn't you say? The sort of language that makes one wonder what exactly he means by action. But here's where it gets particularly interesting. When addressing Reform UK's controversial policy to end indefinite leave to remain, a policy that could theoretically see legal immigrants who've lived in Britain for generations deported if they don't meet new requirements, Starmer made this rather extraordinary statement. He said, and I quote, "If you say they should now be deported, then mark my words, we will fight you with everything we have because you are the enemy of national renewal." Enemy, not opponent, not rival, enemy. Now, if you're Nigel Farage, hearing the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom describe you and your party as the enemy, calling for people to fight you with everything they have, using martial language about battles and being armed, you might reasonably feel that the temperature has been raised just a touch, wouldn't you? Zia Youssef certainly thinks so. Speaking to Sky News Breakfast, he didn't hold back. He accused Starmer of embarking on a campaign with his cabinet to demonize Farage, claiming the Prime Minister knows full well he cannot beat Nigel at the ballot box. And there's some truth to that, isn't there? Reform UK's surge in popularity has been one of the most significant political developments in recent British politics. There's siphoning votes from the Conservatives, certainly, but also from Labour's traditional working-class base. Starmer has every reason to be concerned about Farage's electoral appeal. But does that justify the language he used? Youssef clearly thinks it crosses a line. He stated explicitly that millions of people in this country would hold the Prime Minister responsible if anything were to happen to Farage. That's not a small accusation. That's suggesting that the Prime Minister's rhetoric could have real-world violent consequences. Now, before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed to British Newsblog, because we're about to delve into an absolutely explosive detail that hasn't received nearly enough attention. Hit that button now, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Here's something that should genuinely concern you regardless of your political allegiances. Youssef also revealed that the authorities cut the size of Farage's security detail by 75% just 2 weeks ago. 75%. Let that sink in for a moment. That's not a minor adjustment. That's a dramatic reduction in protection for one of Britain's most prominent and, let's be frank, most divisive political figures. a man who, by his own admission, received state-provided close protection following the summer riots when, as he put it, so many commentators tried to put the blame on me. And this cut allegedly occurred around the time of some rather concerning security incidents. Yusuf mentioned party donors having to step in to ensure Farage is adequately protected. So we have a situation where private individuals are funding security for a member of parliament because the state has apparently decided he doesn't need as much protection anymore. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? The Prime Minister ramps up his rhetoric, describes Farage and reform as enemies who must be fought with everything Labour has, calls for action not just words, and simultaneously, Farage's state-provided security is slashed by 3/4. Now, the Home Office has been terribly proper about all this, issuing a statement saying that decisions on MP security are made independently of ministers. How reassuring. Except we're expected to believe that in a highly centralized Westminster system, where cabinet ministers have their fingers in every pie, security decisions about the Prime Minister's chief political rival are made in a complete vacuum, utterly divorced from any political considerations whatsoever. If you believe that, I've got a rather attractive bridge to sell you. The House of Commons has been equally opaque, declining to comment on the specific claim about Farage security being cut, hiding behind the entirely reasonable justification that they don't discuss individual MP security arrangements. Fair enough. One wouldn't want to compromise anyone's safety by broadcasting their protection details to the world. But the convenient thing about invoking security concerns is that it allows institutions to avoid accountability entirely. Was Farage's security actually cut? If so, why? Who made that decision? Was it based purely on threat assessment? Or were other factors at play? We simply don't know. And apparently, we're not allowed to know. What we do know is this. Sir Keir Starmer stood before his party and delivered what can only be described as a remarkably bellicose speech targeting Farage and Reform UK specifically. He used language of warfare, of enemies, of fighting with every breath and being armed for battle. And when asked directly by GB News if he risked inciting violence or inflaming tensions, his response was a curt, no, not at all. Well, that's cleared that up then, hasn't it? The Prime Minister says is not inciting violence, so we can all rest easy. Except millions of Britons apparently don't feel terribly reassured by that denial. Pat McFadden, a senior cabinet minister, attempted to deflect criticism by suggesting Reform is protesting because they don't want to discuss their actual policies, specifically the indefinite leave to remain proposal. He described that policy as deeply UN British and a mistake. Now that's a legitimate line of political attack. Criticize the policy. Debate its merits. Explain why you think it's wrong. That's how democracy is supposed to function. But that's not quite the same as what Starmer did. Is it? Starmer didn't just criticize a policy. He described an entire political party and its supporters as enemies who must be fought. There's a rather significant difference between those two approaches. If you're finding this analysis valuable and you want to stay informed about what's really happening in British politics, beyond the carefully curated narratives you get elsewhere, make absolutely certain you're subscribed to British Newsblog. We don't shy away from the uncomfortable questions. Let's consider the broader context here for a moment. Britain in 2025 is not in a particularly stable state. We've seen riots, political polarization reaching levels not witnessed in decades, and a general sense that the centre cannot hold. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. Social media has created echo chambers where people consume entirely different versions of reality. Politicians are increasingly viewed not as public servants but as self-serving careerists utterly disconnected from ordinary people's lives. Into this powder keg steps Nigel Farage, a man who has made his entire career out of being the outsider, the disruptor, the voice of those who feel ignored by the Westminster establishment. Love him or loathe him, and Britain certainly seems divided on that question. Farage is undeniably effective at channeling public frustration. And that makes him dangerous to the established order. Not dangerous in the sense that is advocating violence or extremism, but dangerous because he represents an existential threat to the comfortable bipartisan consensus that has dominated British politics for decades. The Conservatives and Labour might disagree on the margins, but they broadly accept the same assumptions about how Britain should be governed. Farage and Reform reject those assumptions entirely. They want fundamental change. They want to tee up the rulebook. And that terrifies people like Starmer because they don't know how to fight it within the normal parameters of British political discourse. So what do you do when you're Prime Minister? Your poll numbers are softening, and there's a populist insurgency gaining traction by the day. Well, apparently, you abandon the traditional British approach of understated criticism and measured disagreement. You reach for the most inflammatory language you can muster. You describe your opponents as enemies. You call for people to fight them with everything they have. You prime your supporters for confrontation. And when someone points out that this rhetoric might possibly have consequences, you dismiss it out of hand. Here's what troubles me about all of this, and this is where I want you to really pay attention. We've seen this playbook before, haven't we? In other countries, in other contexts. You demonize your political opponents. You describe them not merely as wrong but as dangerous, as threats to the nation itself. You use language that dehumanizes them. You prime your base to view them as enemies rather than fellow citizens with different opinions. And then, when something happens, when some unbalanced individual takes that rhetoric as permission to act, everyone expresses shock and dismay. How could this have happened? Who could have predicted this? Thoughts and prayers all around. Except it was entirely predictable because the groundwork was laid by the very rhetoric that preceded it. Violence gets normalized. It starts with rhetoric that makes it acceptable to view your opponents not as people with whom you disagree, but as threats that must be eliminated. And before you dismiss this as alarmist, remember that Farage has already been targeted. He's had milkshakes thrown at him, which might seem trivial until you realize that next time it might not be a milkshake. He's received credible enough threats that the state deemed it necessary to provide him with close protection. And now that protection has been dramatically reduced at precisely the moment when the Prime Minister is ramping up rhetoric describing him as an enemy. If you can't see why that's concerning, I don't know what to tell you. Still not subscribed? What are you waiting for? British News Blog is one of the few channels willing to have these conversations honestly. Hit that button now. The other aspect of this that deserves scrutiny is the utter lack of self-awareness from Labour. This is the party that spent years, rightly, condemning inflammatory rhetoric from their opponents. They were vocal critics of Boris Johnson's language around Brexit, arguing that describing parliamentary opposition as betrayal was dangerous and irresponsible. They condemned Donald Trump's rhetoric in the strongest possible terms. They've positioned themselves as the adults in the room, the party of responsible governance, the defenders of democratic norms. And yet here's their leader engaging in precisely the sort of divisive, martial language they've spent years criticizing. The hypocrisy is rather breathtaking, isn't it? What makes this even more concerning is that Starmer isn't some backbench firebrand. He's not a junior minister shooting from the hip. He's the Prime Minister. Every word he utters is carefully considered, workshopped, focus grouped. His conference speech wasn't an off-the-cuff remark. It was a prepared address, presumably reviewed by multiple advisors before delivery. Which means that people within the Labour machine looked at that language about fighting enemies with everything they have and thought, yes, that's absolutely fine. Let's go with that. Either they genuinely don't understand the implications of such rhetoric, which is worrying, or they understand perfectly well and decided the political benefit outweighed the risks, which is somehow even more concerning. The sad reality is that British politics is becoming Americanized. We're importing the worst aspects of transatlantic political culture. The hyperbole, the demonization, the treatment of political opponents as enemies rather than adversaries. Britain used to pride itself on a different approach. Robust debate, certainly. Sharp exchanges across the dispatch box, absolutely. But underpinning it all was a recognition that we're all ultimately on the same side, trying to make Britain better, just with different ideas about how to achieve that. That consensus is crumbling before our eyes, and speeches like Starmer's are accelerating its demise. Reform UK, whatever you think of their policies, represents a significant chunk of British public opinion. They won over 4 million votes at the last election. That's not a fringe movement. That's millions of your fellow citizens who looked at the options available and decided that Farage and Reform best represented their interests. You can disagree with them. You can think they are wrong. But describing them and their chosen representatives as enemies who must be fought is to fundamentally reject the premise of democracy itself. Democracy requires accepting that people you disagree with have the same right to political representation as you do. It requires engaging with their arguments, not demonizing them out of existence. Starmer's speech suggests he's given up on persuading reform voters and has instead decided to go full tribal warfare. He's betting that he can mobilize his base by presenting reform as an existential threat. It might work politically. Fear is a powerful motivator. But the cost to our political culture will be significant. Because once you've described your opponents as enemies, once you've called for them to be fought with everything you have, you can't easily walk that back. The genie doesn't go back in the bottle. You've legitimized a level of confrontation that will inevitably escalate. Before we wrap this up, make sure you're subscribed to British Newsblog, because we'll be following this story as it develops, and trust me, this isn't over. The Metropolitan Police, the Labour Party, and Downing Street have all been contacted for comment on these accusations, and their responses, or lack thereof, will be telling. So where does this leave us? We have a Prime Minister using inflammatory language about his chief political rival. We have that rival's security detail allegedly slashed by 3/4. We have accusations that the Prime Minister will be held responsible by millions if anything happens to Farage. And we have a political culture that seems to be spiraling into increasingly tribal and confrontational territory. None of this is healthy. None of this is normal. And all of it should concern you regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. Because today it's directed at Farage, but tomorrow it could be directed at anyone who challenges the prevailing orthodoxy. The test of a democracy isn't how it treats people in power. It's how it treats those who challenge power. And right now, by that measure, British democracy is looking rather fragile indeed. Starmer may genuinely believe he's fighting for Britain's soul, but he might want to consider whether the methods he's employing are eroding the very thing he claims to be defending. History will judge not just his intentions, but his impact. And if his rhetoric contributes to an atmosphere where political violence becomes normalized, that judgment will be harsh indeed. This is British Newsblog, where we don't just repeat the official line. We ask the questions others won't. If you value that, subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and we'll see you in the next one. Because in British politics today, the most important stories are the ones they hope you'll ignore.